More calls to stop Trump, why some Republicans want to block his path to the nomination. Brokered convention, the RNC's chief strategist explains what's at stake. Presidential visit, the political fallout to President Obama's trip to Cuba. And our one-on-one interview with Cardinal Pell, what he says about Vatican reforms. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, March 18th, 2016. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Donald Trump faces a backlash from some conservative Republicans. Their Stop Trump movement seeks to block his nomination.
He's going to be our nominee. And, you know, some of these guys are going to have to decide how much damage they're willing to do to the party because they don't like that.
Trump says there would be riots if he's denied the Republican nomination after securing the most delegates. Still, top conservatives met privately in Washington yesterday to discuss ways to stop Trump, even raising the possibility of a third-party candidate. Speaker Paul Ryan says he's not interested.
It's not going to be me. It should be somebody running for president.
Senator Ted Cruz would need about 80% of the remaining delegates to beat Donald Trump. Governor John Kasich can't beat Trump, even if he wins every delegate. He's counting on a brokered convention. Trump's national campaign co-chair urges Republicans not to change the convention rules.
If the Republican Party comes into that convention and jimmies with the rules and takes away the will of the people, the will of the Republicans and the Democrats and the independents who have voted for Mr. Trump, I will take off my credentials, I will leave the floor of that convention, and I will leave the Republican Party forever.
Sean Spicer is the Chief Strategist and Communications Director for the Republican National Committee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On March 7th, you said that you are not concerned that there will be a brokered convention. Actually, you said with 85% certainty. It's now March 18th. What do you say?
Probably a little lower, but I still believe we've gotten about 1,400 delegates selected. Mm-hmm. We've got just over 1,100 to go. I still think that historically the odds are that we will end up with the nominee. As we look at the math unfold in the coming weeks, I think we'll have a better idea.
Then let's just play the parlor game,
Sure.
The fun part of this. So the Rules Committee,
Yep.
if we're going into a brokered convention, the Rules Committee decides the regulations, who's on the ballot and when delegates can switch to a different party. Who are these people who have such power?
So it's a great question. Two pieces to this. Number one, delegates are elected in every state and in every congressional district, depending on the state. So in the same way you elect a member of Congress to go to Washington and represent you in the House of Representatives, Republican voters choose delegates, as you know, and those delegates go to our national convention and act on their behalf. In some states, they are bound by the outcome of the vote. Most of the time, in a majority of those cases, if you ever get to a second ballot, they're
you can
not
switch.
It's not switching; they become unbound,
so that then
and
they can vote for whomever they want.
They can vote for whomever they want.
Now, what's to stop a third party from coming in and saying, "Hey, it's the majority is going to put forward this third party. Why not allow him in?"
In theory, nothing could stop it. I think that there is, getting back to my percentages, I'd say that you have 99 point something percent, 99.5, 99.6.
That it wouldn't
happen. I think the idea of someone who is not one of the three individuals there, it's unfathomable to me.
Right. Trump supporters say that Republican leaders like yourself are trying to sabotage his campaign if we go forward. Is that true?
Look, number one, this has never happened since 1948, right? There has never been a second ballot.
Well, what about 76?
76 was one ballot. Ford and Reagan.
Right.
Ford had a plurality, not a majority, and went into the convention and on the first ballot won it. So you could see that happen again. But again, until you get 1,237 delegates, you haven't won the majority. That's how the system works. If we did go to a second ballot, then that would be each of those candidates.
Got it.
Whoever's name was in nomination would be fighting it out.
The real question is, are leaders who don't want Trump, who are trying to stop Trump, are leaders of the Republican Party actually going to be able to do this through the Rules Committee?
The beauty of a democratic process is that we have two things going for all of us. One, the right to express ourselves, pro or con against the candidate, and two, the right to vote. I think everyone's going to exercise both of those rights in the next, coming up to Cleveland.
Sean Spicer, Chief Strategist for the Republican National Committee. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. We're following a developing story in Belgium where police say they arrested the primary suspect in November's terror attack in Paris. Salah Abdeslam was captured after 4 months at large. He was shot in the leg during a major police operation in Brussels that led to his arrest. Investigators say Abdeslam was among several attackers who targeted cafes, a rock concert, and a stadium. It was Paris's deadliest attack in decades. 130 people died. North Korea launches another ballistic missile into the sea, despite the United Nations and the United States imposing stringent sanctions again earlier in March. The launch came days after North Korea leader Kim Jong-un ordered more missile and nuclear tests. Analysts say the country is trying to develop nuclear warheads small enough to fit on a ballistic missile. U.S. allies like South Korea and Japan are both in missile range. President Obama travels to Cuba Sunday, the first time any U.S. president has visited the nation in 88 years. I'll be with him on this historic trip.
We are under no illusions that the Castro regime or Cuba is going to change overnight. But
Obama says his policies to accelerate travel, business exchanges, and internet access have been welcomed by Cubans and could lead to more improvements. Our new relationship with Cuba is dividing lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Critics say the détente gives Cuba a pass despite grave human rights abuses. Jason Calvi talked to politicians on both sides of the aisle.
The cars are as old as the revolution, led by Fidel Castro in 1959. The U.S. imposed a trade embargo on the communist nation a year later.
Es realmente muy bueno. Quisiera, no sé, que abolieran el bloqueo para.
Cubans look forward to the day it's lifted, but Congress must vote to do that.
Despite the president's attempt to undermine this embargo by executive action, he is ultimately bound by it. That is the law of the land.
Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota is sponsoring a bill to end the embargo.
If all these tens of millions of Americans go to Cuba, they need a place to stay. And if we don't do anything about it, they're going to be staying in Spanish hotels and eating Chinese food. Our farmers, our workers, our hotel industry wants to compete on an even playing field with the rest of the world.
U.S. law also bans tourism to Cuba. But new rules allow Americans to take educational trips on their own without special permission. Republican Senator Jeff Flake will travel with the president. He agrees with the changes.
There are still human rights abuses that occur in Cuba. The difference is, how can we best remedy that? And for 50 years, we've had a policy of isolating Cuba and hoping that things will change there, and they haven't. So now we're embarking on a new course.
Obama will meet Cuban President Raul Castro, attend a state dinner, and watch a baseball game. Congresswoman Elena Ross-Layton of Florida says it's a travesty.
The leader of the free world has chosen a legacy shopping photo op, enjoying a baseball game with a murderer and a thug.
And the White House says the president will openly speak with Castro about human rights. They say he'll also meet with dissidents, those who are opposed to the Castro government. And he'll be giving a major speech, which will be carried on Cuban television. Lauren?
Jason, what does the Cuban government think of all of these calls for change?
Well, they slammed the president. They said he should worry about empowering Americans. They say Cubans have been empowered since the Castro Revolution, but they are hungry for American investment. One of the things they're doing right now is they're working on getting rid of a penalty for exchanging, for converting American dollars in that country. And Lauren, that penalty, 10%.
That's a lot. All right, Jason Calvi, thank you very much. The government needs to invest more money to solve the Flint water crisis. That's according to a doctor who first discovered dangerous lead levels in children. She says Flint needs to eliminate all sources of lead.
Now we've learned so much more about lead, and we have learned that there is no safe level of lead. There is not any level that doesn't cause deleterious harm.
The doctor has also testified on Capitol Hill weeks before yesterday's hearing, where lawmakers blasted Michigan's governor and the head of the EPA for not responding to the Flint water crisis sooner. The Vatican says Pope Francis is planning a trip to Armenia in June. It comes 1 year after the Pope upset Turkey by declaring that Ottoman Turks committed genocide against Armenians. That was around the time of World War I. No details of the Pope's trip were announced. The U.S. State Department says ISIS is committing genocide against Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria. Yesterday's announcement marks only the second time the U.S. has declared genocide in an ongoing conflict. The first was in Darfur. Naomi Kiekeler is the Director of Policy and Advocacy with the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. That's at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the designation of genocide first came into play after World War II, after the Holocaust. How did that help the Jewish people?
The recognition through the Genocide Convention that the international community has a responsibility to prevent genocide and also punish perpetrators was an important step in recognizing not just the horrors of the crimes that happened during the Holocaust, but also to ensure that future generations did not suffer those crimes. And that's why we're interested today in this designation.
And what does that mean, that future generations won't suffer?
I think one of the most important things for the survivors of the Holocaust and for the families of the victims is to ensure that other communities do not similarly have to go through the horrors of what was experienced during the Holocaust, the destruction of families, the destruction of an entire people.
It's rare for the U.S. administration to declare genocide while a conflict is ongoing. Why do you think it's important in this case?
I think at this particular moment, we have seen hundreds of thousands of people forced from their homes. When I was in northern Iraq, interviewed members of the Yazidi community where men had survived massacres of hundreds of people, where women had been enslaved for sexual slavery en masse. I met a young boy of 7 who had been enslaved by the Islamic State. Oh. These people need to have those crimes recognized. Perpetrators need to be held punishable.
But the genocide designation will do that?
In the case of the genocide designation, the only clear legal obligation is to hold perpetrators accountable. So it will allow for an investigation, documentation, and ideally future crimes.
Thank you so much, Naomi Kiekeler from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Thank you.
Coming up, Vatican reforms. Cardinal Pell sits down for a candid interview. And a new push to limit Planned Parenthood, how one state is trying to reform sex education. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Dozens of rabbis plan to boycott Donald Trump's speech to the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. He's scheduled to address AIPAC Monday night. AIPAC is the nation's largest pro-Israeli lobbying group. The rabbis say they're concerned about Trump's lack of understanding about the Middle East. John Gizzi is the chief political columnist and White House correspondent for Newsmax. John, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Lauren.
What do you think about that ban that the rabbis plan to have?
They're obviously trying to make a statement, and I think it has to do with Mr. Trump's repeated invocation of his reputation as a deal maker in trying to solve the controversy and conflict in the Middle East.
And why wouldn't they like that term, deal maker?
Deal maker is a buzzword, just like compromise is, that the rabbinical community, as well as most American Jews, do not want someone who's going to make a deal or go halfway. To them, that means a less than solid commitment to the state of Israel.
So let's switch topics here. We've had a very busy political week, a new nomination for the Supreme Court.
Yes.
What do you think the chances are of anything happening with that nomination?
On a scale of 1 to 10, 2.
Okay, that's honest.
Right, and I'm being generous with that.
Right.
Look, Merrick Garland is what I call the dinner party choice for the Supreme Court. You hear his name all the time here in Washington, discussed at length. I once did a cover story on him many years ago as a possible Supreme Court justice, and he is passed over repeatedly. Now he has his turn, but Senate Republicans are adamant. They may meet with him, they'll be very nice to the distinguished Chief Judge, but they are not going to give him a hearing until after the election.
The president is on his way to Cuba. I'm heading with him.
Very good.
What are your thoughts on the deal that he has cut with Cuba?
Well, at this point, one has to realize the president is going to change courses with Cuba from what has been our policy for the last half century. He continues to open up relationships, to bring more people there, and it certainly is the talk of the traveling class. On the other hand, the Cuban American community, and particularly those who are associated with the Republican Party, have dug in their heels. Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton summed up that view when she said, "Why is he going to a baseball game with a thug and a murderer?"
Oh, there you go. John Gizzi, thank you so much. Newsmax political columnist.
Always a pleasure, Lauren. Have a nice trip.
Thank you. The Alaska Senate approves a bill this week that bans school from contracting with abortion providers like Planned Parenthood for sexual education classes. It moves on to the House committee Monday. Alaska State Senator Mike Dunleavy sponsored the bill. He joins us now from Juneau. Thank you for joining us, State Senator. Tell me why this bill is so important to you.
Well, my career, my profession has been public education. I've been a teacher, principal, superintendent, school board president, worked for the university, and my whole background is public education. My family, my daughters, 3 daughters have gone to public school, and so this has been my profession, my career. We've had parents call us, and unbeknownst to myself, we didn't realize to the extent, but that there are abortion providers going into our schools under the guise of teaching sex education, and as a result, they're getting in between parents and their children.
What exactly is Planned Parenthood doing, and where's the funding coming from?
Well, that's a good question, and we're trying to find that out, exactly where the funding's coming from. We believe it's coming from the federal government to come in and teach these particular courses in this particular worldview, and we're looking into that. But we felt we didn't have the time to do all the background work in terms of where the funding's coming from and exactly how many schools they're in. Although we know they're in a number of schools in our state. We felt that we had to get on this pretty quick as a result of parents calling me, other groups calling me, asking us, why are we allowing this to happen in our schools?
We did a little bit of research on our own, and we found that there are similar measures in Missouri and Louisiana. Why do you think this is not more widespread, that bills like this are being passed?
I think people don't understand what's happening. I think oftentimes parents send their their children to school on a bus. They assume that the best is happening at the schools. And really, sometimes these things only come to light when a child comes home and starts to question the parents' values, the parents' worldview. And once that happens, people realize what's going on. But I think it's probably a lot more widespread than people think. Under some of the federal funding that goes into schools, there's actually money set aside for abortion providers to come into the schools to, quote, teach sex ed. And it's become very concerning.
Thank you so much for joining us, State Senator Mike Dunleavy, whose district is north of Wasilla, Alaska.
Thank you.
Cardinal George Pell, who is helping with the Holy Father's reform in the Vatican, sat down with EWTN Rome producer Mary Shovlin this week. He lauds Pope Francis for taking on reforms.
You who work so closely with Francis, how can we sum up these past 3 years, and where are we going, you think?
The Holy Father is centered on Christ. He wants the call to conversion, to faith and goodness, to mercy to be absolutely central. And he works consistently for that. He's a man of enormous sympathy and empathy. And we wouldn't be anywhere with the financial reforms without his backing. And there are so many vested interests. A lot of people that don't really understand what we're doing, don't understand the need for transparency. Yeah. So that I'm enormously grateful to him for his backing of this.
Cardinal Pell also opened up to us about his emotional meeting with Australian victims of clergy sex abuse, and we'll have that story on Monday. Up next, hear the inside story of Mother Teresa's canonization. We talk to the man who led the process. And on the eve of his feast day, learn about St. Joseph's Table. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Lauren Ashburn. After months of anticipation this week, the Vatican officially announced Mother Teresa of Calcutta will be canonized a saint on September 4th. That same day marks a special jubilee for workers and volunteers of mercy. Father Brian Kolodechuk is the postulator for Mother Teresa's cause of canonization. What does it mean to be a postulator?
Well, the postulator is the one who represents the group that is presenting a person for canonization. And so in this case, it's the Missionaries of Charity. And so as an MC, I was chosen to be the one who represents the MC family.
You met her very young in your life. Why do you think she is a saint, is going to be considered a saint?
Well, yes, I met Mother when I was just a young fellow of 21 years old here in Rome because my sister was entering the novitiate for the sisters. And, you know, I think the saint is a hero for us Catholics especially, someone who really is an example for us, one who we can look up to, try to follow, and as we look at her life. And then she also now and from heaven prays for us for all of our needs and really accompanies us on our own journey of faith.
In her life, she experienced what she called the dark night of the soul, when she felt distant from God at times. Is that part of what makes her a saint?
Oh, I think besides her entire life together, which is heroic, the single most heroic thing of her life was exactly what she called the darkness. And so this feeling of rejection from Jesus, but at the same time living in solidarity with especially the spiritual poverty, and especially of the West, of all those who were or who feel unloved, unwanted, uncared for.
Father Brian Kolodechuk, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on completing your mission.
Thank you so much.
Tomorrow we celebrate the Feast of St. Joseph. He's known as the protector of family, and his feast day is especially significant to Italians and Italian Americans. Tonight, Wyatt Goolsby shows us an age-old tradition to honor him.
St. Joseph is the husband of the Virgin Mary and foster father of Jesus. Millions of Catholics around the world pray for his intercession. Every year, the National Italian American Foundation, based in Washington, D.C., hosts a special meal, La Tavola di San Giuseppe, or St. Joseph's Table.
St. Joseph is a patron saint of Sicily, and in medieval times he was said to have saved the island from drought and became a patronal feast for the entire island. And that tradition came over with the Sicilian Americans that came to the United States beginning in the 1860s and 70s. So it's a very important day for us. It's quietly our St. Patrick's Day, I think.
The table includes an altar, flowers, bread, and most importantly, zeppoles. The food can vary, but there's no meat since the feast always falls in Lent.
As important as the food is, the focal point of St. Joseph's Table is the altar itself, and there's a lot of symbolism here as well. There are 3 levels representing the Trinity. There are lilies which represent St. Joseph's purity, virtue, and holiness, and at the center of all of it is the St. Joseph statue itself of him holding the Christ child.
I really recognize this amazing connection between both faith and family and the culture that created it.
Jeannie Allen, a practicing Catholic and Italian American, says it's important for her to pass on her devotion to St. Joseph to her sons.
So today, day and age when technology is ubiquitous, when we all just don't need to learn anything, we can just go on Google to find it, when tradition is so hard to maintain, those of us who feel family is so important want and need places and institutions beyond the church that value and support it.
So on this St. Joseph's Day, whether you're Italian or not, don't forget to celebrate the head of the Holy Family. Wyatt Goolsby, EWTN News Nightly.
Well, Pope Francis is extending his reach into social media. Vatican Radio says he'll launch his own Instagram account tomorrow under the name Franciscus. The Pope already has a Twitter account with over 26 million followers. You can follow us on Twitter at EWTN, and I'm at Lauren Ashburn. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Enjoy your weekend.